Hello, all of my wonderful 7th graders. I hope you guys had a great weekend and you got to spend some good family time together. So we are going to continue on with our general biology, and we're starting off with mycology. So the root word myc means mushroom or fungi. So mycology is the study of fungi. A saprophyte is an organism that obtains their nourishment from dead organisms. So fungi are saprophytes because they do not perform photosynthesis. They can't obviously go to the grocery store, so they break down dead matter, and that is how they feed themselves. So the picture that you see is called a fairy ring, and these are all mushrooms, but the mushrooms that you see, this actually is just one large mushroom, even though you see many caps. So fungi, which you're most familiar with, are club fungi. So this is like a type of club fungi. They are mostly made up of what is known as hyphae, and they grow into clumps known as mycelium. So mycelium is really the main body of a mushroom or fungi. The cap up top releases spores, but it really is just almost kind of for reproduction, but it's really not a main component of the mushroom. So if you guys have a patch of mushrooms in your yard and you pull up the mushroom, the stalk, and the cap, you're going to notice that in a few days there is another stalk and cap because you really didn't get up the main portion of the fungi. It really is underground. If you dig a hole where you see the cap and stalk, you're going to see it. It looks kind of like roots, but it's not really roots. It's slightly different. So the body of the mushroom releases the spores but does not produce food for the fungi. So really what is obtaining the nutrients is the mycelium by breaking things down in the earth. So that is what mycology is. If you guys look at your note, you have what is mycology? Mycology is the study of fungi. And what are saprophytes? Saprophytes are organisms that obtain their nourishment from dead organisms. Your next note says, what is the main body of the fungi and where is it located? The main body of the fungi is really the mycelium, and it's located under the ground, so you can't see it. Okay, guys, fill out your note. Botany is the study of plants, and if you look at the physiology of a plant, it's the study of how certain parts of a plant function and work together. So plants, they are autotrophs. If you look at the word troph, it means nourishment. And if you think of the word auto, it means self. So they are self-nourishers. They make their own food. And they make their own food through the process of photosynthesis, which we have talked about in the last module. So inside a plant cell, there is an organelle known as chloroplast, and inside the chloroplast is a green pigment known as chlorophyll. So right here, this says chloroplast, and this is showing you the inside, and what looks kind of like little pancake stacks, that's really the chlorophyll. So the chlorophyll is what captures sunlight, and it combines the sunlight with carbon dioxide, which you have right here, CO2. So it combines carbon dioxide with water and the sun's energy inside the little chlorophyll. And what happens is it creates, this is the chemical formula for glucose and oxygen. So here the sunlight is coming in, O2 is produced for you and me, glucose is then produced, and then what happens after it makes the glucose, because it needs glucose to survive, it needs it for food, and what it doesn't use, it ends up storing. But when it uses the glucose, it sends it into another organelle called the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is the power plant of a cell. So the glucose goes into the mitochondria, and you can see that down here. Right here is the glucose, and it adds oxygen. And then what happens is it creates carbon dioxide and water and energy. The energy that is created, the cell then uses. So your body can move because your mitochondria is producing energy for your body to move. So this is called respiration. And when you think of the word respiration, you probably think maybe something like respiratory system or to respirate, which means to breathe. So when your mitochondria break down the food that you eat, you produce energy, but when you breathe out, if you breathed onto a glass surface or a mirror, you would notice that it would fog up because you are breathing out water vapor, but also you are breathing out carbon dioxide. So cells go through something called respiration. So that happens in all cells. If you guys did the yeast experiment, you would see that the yeast, they are respirating. So that is something all cells do. So you're going to also see that the energy that the mitochondria make is called ATP. That's just the fancy word for what type of energy it creates. So this cycle of creating food through photosynthesis in the cells respirating is a cycle. It happens over and over and over again in plant cells, human cells. That is constantly happening. So you guys have a note. You have plants are blank since they make their own food. They are autotrophs. Plants make their own food through what? They make their own food through photosynthesis inside plant cells, which are organelles known as chloroplasts, and they are filled with chlorophyll, which makes the plant green. Okay, so those are your notes you can fill for now. So here's kind of a summary of plants. You have a few reading pages that go with this, but this is kind of what I want you to take away from it. So perennials, they typically have a woody trunk or stem, and they grow year after year. So if your mom goes to Lowe's, she might look at the tag and see if it's a perennial or annual. I love a perennial because you plant it once and it comes back year after year. I really don't have to do much with a perennial, whereas an annual has an herbaceous stem and it lives for only 1 year. So like a daisy is only going to live for 1 year, and it's something I have to plant over and over again if I want it to come back. So leaves come in many shapes and sizes. We're not going to go into great detail about that, but on a plant, they can be a simple leaf, a compound, which means it has many leaves on one stem. It can be elliptical, oval, lobed, or even a cluster of needles. So like a pine tree, the needles, those are technically the tree's leaves. So trees that lose their leaves are deciduous. So that means that they lose their leaves in the winter. The tree is then hibernating and sleeping over the winter time, and then in the spring, new leaves bud. So roots, their main function is to absorb water and nutrients, and they transport the nutrients to other parts of the plant. They also anchor a plant into the ground, and they store excess food in the form of starch. So like a potato is really a root, and just like a carrot is really a root. And what happens is as the greens make photosynthesis, the vegetable or fruit grows, and that then stores the starch, and then you eat the starch. So stems can be a vine, a trunk, or a flower stem. They support a plant, they produce leaves, and they transport water and nutrients. Some stems can produce food through photosynthesis. So stems can perform some photosynthesis, but the main function of a leaf is really to perform the photosynthesis and also the respiration part for the plant. You guys may fill in perennials grow when, annuals live for, what do roots do, and what do stems do. And then we'll go to the next one. So plant classification, there are two types of plant classification we're going to talk about, vascular and non-vascular. So if I say vascular, you guys may have an idea of what that is from anatomy last year. You have a vascular system. So if you look in your wrist, you're going to see blue lines in your wrist. That's part of your vascular system. It's how blood gets transported around your body. So vascular plants, they have a specific tissue that helps move materials such as water and nutrients through the plant. So kind of like little tubes through the plant. They are further divided into non-flowering plants and flowering plants. So some vascular plants produce flowers and some vascular plants do not produce flowers. Most of the organisms you probably think of as plants, such as trees, bushes, and flowers, fit into this group. So trees, bushes, and flowers, they are all vascular plants. They have a network of tubes that go through them to deliver water and nutrients throughout the plant. And then you have non-vascular plants. There are way more vascular plants than there are non-vascular plants. So non-vascular plants are typically really small, and they're mosses and different types of plants like a moss, kind of spongy, low to the ground. They're typically in moist places, in forest. They use diffusion and osmosis to move material through the plant. So if you guys did your egg experiment, what they do is they just soak gases and water and nutrients through the plant itself because they don't have root stems and leaves like typical plants do. They're slightly different, so they have to use osmosis and diffusion.
When we were kids growing up in West Texas, our winters would be cold but rarely experience snow. But we did have ice, which resulted in the roads being salted. As the salt mixes in and dissolves into water on the road, this can lead to a lower freezing point, which can help prevent the roads from icing over. And while this is great for making the roads more safe, it wasn't so great for the plants that lived right along the roadside. It often caused them to die. Now, winter can be hard for many plant species, but I'm talking about this salt affecting even some hardy plant life. This issue with salt in plants isn't limited to winter. During hurricanes near the coast, salty ocean water can be dumped in large quantities into the soil. This can eventually kill plants, including trees that had originally survived the hurricane. Why? Do plants just dislike salt that much? Well, it's actually related to a term called osmosis. When you are talking about osmosis, you are talking about the movement of water through a semi-permeable membrane, like a cell membrane. Water molecules are so small that they can travel through the cell membrane unassisted, or they can travel in larger quantities through protein channels like aquaporins. The movement of water molecules traveling across a cell membrane is passive transport, which means it does not require energy. In osmosis, water molecules travel from areas of a high concentration of water molecules to a low concentration of water molecules. But there's another way to think about water movement in osmosis. A low water concentration likely means there is a greater solute concentration. Solutes are substances like salt or sugar that can be dissolved within a solvent, like water. Water has the tendency to move to areas where there is a higher solute concentration, which would mean less water concentration. So if you want to easily figure out where the water will travel in osmosis, look to the side where there is a greater solute concentration. Unless we bring in another variable, like pressure, water will generally have a net movement to the area of higher solute concentration. So let's bring out a U-tube. U-tube, that's funny. There's a semi-permeable membrane in the middle of it. Let's assume that it is similar to a cell membrane and that water molecules can squeeze through it. The molecules are quite small, but salt can't. Right now, there's just water in this U-tube. The water levels on side A and side B are equal. That doesn't mean that the water molecules aren't moving. Water molecules like to move, but the net movement across the two sides is zero. That means the overall change in direction of movement is zero. Now, let's imagine on side B, you dump a huge amount of salt there. So which direction will the water initially move towards? A or B? Think about what we mentioned with osmosis. The answer is B. Side B has a higher solute concentration than side A. Water moves to areas of higher solute concentration, which is also the area of lower water concentration. You will also see the water level on side B rise as the water moves to that area. You can almost think of the water as trying to equalize the concentrations, diluting side B, Once equilibrium is reached, the net movement of water across the two sides will be zero, but remember that water still likes to move and movement still occurs. Now here's some vocabulary to add in here. We call side B hypertonic. That means higher solute concentration. But we can't just say something is hypertonic without comparing it to something else. We say side B is hypertonic to side A because it has a higher solute concentration than side A. In osmosis, water moves to the hypertonic side. We say side A is hypotonic. Hypo rhymes with low, which helps me remember that it's the low solute concentration when compared to side B. Let's get a little more real life now instead of just the YouTube. As you know, water is important for your body and many processes that occur in the body. When someone gets an IV in a hospital, it might look like the fluid in the IV is just pure water. But it is certainly not pure water. That would be a disaster because of osmosis. Let's explain. Let's say hypothetically pure water was in an IV. Now an IV tube typically runs through a vein so that you have access to your bloodstream. Really useful for running medication through. Blood actually consists of many different types of components, and red blood cells are a great example. So what do you think has a higher solute concentration? The hypothetical pure water in this IV tube, or the red blood cells? Well, cells are not empty vessels. They contain solutes. The pure water that hypothetically is running through this IV tube has no solutes. So where does the water go? It goes to the area of higher solute concentration, which in this case is inside the cells. The cells are hypertonic compared to the pure water in the IV tube because the cells have a greater solute concentration. The cells would swell and possibly burst. Exploding red blood cells are not good. If a person needs fluids, they typically will receive a solution that is isotonic to their blood plasma. Isotonic means equal concentration, so you won't have any swelling or shrinking red blood cells. Another example, let's talk about the aquarium. I have always wanted a saltwater fish tank ever since I was a little kid, but I've only had freshwater tanks so far. I did often question when I was a kid, why is it that a saltwater fish can't be in a freshwater tank? Well, let me explain one reason why this would be dangerous to the saltwater fish and how it relates to osmosis. First ask, where is the higher solute concentration? In the saltwater fish cells or in the freshwater that the fish would be hypothetically placed in? Definitely in the saltwater fish cells. So where would the water go? It goes to the area where there's a higher solute concentration, the hypertonic side, so it goes into the cells of that poor saltwater fish. If not rescued, it could die. Now, one thing to clarify, saltwater fish and freshwater fish are not necessarily isotonic to their surroundings, but they have special adaptations that allow them to live in their environment and usually cannot make a major switch from a saltwater environment to a freshwater one. Now, not all fish have this problem. There are some fish that have this amazing adaptation to switch between fresh and salt water, and they have to deal with this osmosis problem. Salmon, for example. I think if I could pick to be a fish, I'd be a salmon. Osmosis explains how many kinds of plants get their water. Sure, many plants have roots, but how does the water get into the roots? When it rains, the soil becomes saturated with water. The root hair cells generally have a higher concentration of solutes within them than the solute concentration in the saturated soil. The water travels into the root hair cells as the root hair cells are hypertonic compared to the hypotonic soil. By the way, you may wonder, well, why don't those root hair cells burst with all the water that's going in them? That brings us to our next osmosis topic and why plant cell walls are amazing. So let's bring in another variable that can influence osmosis, pressure potential. This is when it's very useful to understand how one can calculate water potential. Water potential considers both solute potential and pressure potential. In osmosis, water travels to areas of lower water potential. So the formula is water potential is equal to the pressure potential plus the solute potential. Adding solute actually causes the solute potential to have a negative value and the overall water potential to lower. Water will travel to areas of lower water potential, but exerting pressure can raise the pressure potential, a positive value, therefore raising the total water potential. So let's give a quick example. In the popular water potential and potato cores lab, all kinds of neat variations of this lab procedure exist online, you can calculate the water potential in potato cores using the water potential formula. When a potato core is first put into distilled water, that's pure water, the potato core cells start to gain water. You'd expect that the water is moving towards the higher solute concentration. Thanks to their higher solute concentration, they have a lower solute potential. That means a lower total water potential than the surroundings, and water travels to areas of lower water potential. But over time, as the potato core cells gain water, the water that has entered exerts pressure against the plant cell walls from inside the plant cells, therefore raising the overall water potential in the potato core cells. We want to point out that this turgor pressure that results in plant cells, thanks to osmosis and plant cell walls, is critical for overall plant structure and the ability of plants to grow upright and not wilt. Turgor pressure is definitely something to explore. In summary, where would living organisms be without osmosis? After all, it involves movement of one of our very valuable resources, water. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Under vascular plants, you have flower plants and cone bearing, so they have seeds. Those are vascular plants, and then you have vascular plants that are not flowering. So flowering plants are a type of vascular plant that produces flowers in order to reproduce. Flowering plants produce seeds within a fruit, and the scientific name for flowering plants is angiosperm. So flowering plants, for any type of fruit or vegetable, you guys eat pretty much all fruit. So carrots, lettuce, things like that, they don't flower. But when I say fruit or vegetable, most of you would think of a vegetable like squash. Squash is really a fruit because it has seeds. So any of those things, so a pumpkin, a watermelon, strawberries, blueberries, apples, oranges, all of those things, tomatoes, they are an angiosperm because at one point in time that plant had a flower just like a rose. A rose is an angiosperm because there was a flower. So that's a very, very common type of plant, a type of vascular plant. And then also we have vascular plants that are not flowering. So there are two main groups of non-flowering plants. There are plants that use spores to reproduce and plants that use seeds to reproduce. So the non-flowering plants that use seeds are called gymnosperms. So they're still vascular plants. So this would be like a pine cone type tree. They're not flowering, but they do use seeds, which are in the pine cone, to reproduce and to make more of themselves. So you have a note for what are vascular plants. So that's going to go along with this slide and the last slide you guys did. So vascular plants have a network of tubes inside that help them to transport water and nutrients around the plant. And vascular plants can have flowers, or they can be without flowers. So both type are vascular. And when you think of vascular plant, you think of a tree, a bush, or any type of plant that has flowers on it. So non-vascular plants, they do not have roots or stems or leaves, since these structures always have some vascular tissue. So on this tree trunk, I have shown you kind of some mosses that are living on this forest floor. So those are non-vascular. So in this group, you will find mosses, liverwort, and hornworts. What you're probably most familiar with are mosses. Most of you probably have some growing somewhere in your yard. So that's an example of a non-vascular plant. So on your note sheet, you have what are non-vascular plants. Please take a moment and fill that in.